So now continuing with this topic of schizophrenia, I want to give you an example. So we have a frequent caller on the lines that he's the one that I mentioned earlier that sometimes though for some people it can get on the way of employment where they might need to get an injection once a month to be able to remain stable for the remainder of the month. Usually that happens if a person is not really complying with the medication because they forget to take it. So then they're required, in some cases, by court order to get an injection once a month as a way to deal with the medication for the entire month. So the example I'm using is that of a frequent caller who believed that he was Moses, and that in terms of their schizophrenia. They believed that in order to prove to God that they were Moses, then they needed to walk through a burning bush. And the way they were going to do that is they were going to pour gasoline all over themselves and light themselves up. Of course, if they had done that, it would have killed them, right? So at that time, then we ended up having a lot of interactions with that person, and then eventually that person ended up being required to get the injections. Now, in terms of today, then what can happen with that caller is that when we're getting close to the end of the month, then that person's calls will actually go up a bit, and their risk level will actually change. So please know when it comes to schizophrenia, you must um, assess for suicide and also safety plan. And you might be thinking, but Edwin, can I even safety plan with a person who might be facing delusions in schizophrenia, right? Well, here's the thing. If you're going to be safety planning with a person, you need to make sure, number one, you consult with the CCC, you alert them that this call is on the lines right now. But then you also check in with the caller. Can they tell the difference, for example, between what is real and what is not, or what is the voices or what is not? Meaning, if the person is in a full psychotic break where they cannot tell the difference, then you cannot safety plan. However, if the person, they tell you, okay, hi, so and so, I'm hearing some voices right now, then you want to ask them, then what are the voices saying? And if the voices are saying, you need to kill yourself, hurt other people, that kind of thing, you want to make sure you check in with them. Can you tell the difference between what's real and what's not? And if the caller says, oh, yeah, no, it's just the voices, I'm not going to act on them, because I face schizophrenia, I know that already, then you may be able to safety plan at that time. But I'm going to encourage you, though, to make those decisions based on your conversations with the CCC at that time. The other part, then, is that one of the things that can happen in schizophrenia, though, is that people will usually trigger when they're in their late teens. So, like 17, 18, 19, and for a few years is the usual sort of window. Now, in terms of what can happen then is that the person may start hearing voices, for example, and then be 17 and thinking, you know what, I this is weird, I don't want to tell anybody, right? So then they might keep going with hearing these voices without reaching out for help. And what might happen then is by the time we get them on the lines, it's sometimes been 3 years since the voices started. And as I mentioned earlier with the Naples study, then one of the things that can happen then is if there was that window, that window that's called the prodromal state, 3 years in, it's probably already been missed. And by now, the person may benefit from going on medication, but the being symptom-free option may not be available to them anymore at that point. So one of the things then is that you want to make sure that you check in terms of how the voices are going. Now, the other part then is that one of the things that can happen then is that trauma can also trigger a genetic marker. Another example of this would be a frequent caller that we have that he actually triggered with schizophrenia very, very young, meaning he had a marker, which was like a coil, that then opened up once he experienced the trauma. And his trauma was actually that he witnessed his mom complete suicide in front of him when he was very, very young. Now, you can imagine, though, when you trigger with your mental health disorder actually really matters. If you trigger later in life, you've had time to live a life where you've gone to school, you've learned to read, you've learned to do lots of things, make friends, and do all these skills without having to deal with things like voices, right? But can you imagine for this very young person then what it was like to have triggered with schizophrenia so young and now be trying to learn to read and trying to learn to do all these skills while dealing with all the symptoms of schizophrenia. So one of the things, like I mentioned, then is about keeping that empathy for our callers, and and if the situation that you're trying to help them with seems difficult, to try to think of them in their younger versions, and to think about having that empathy for that child that didn't ask for the situation to get triggered for them. And then the other part here then is that with these callers then, what kind of support do you lend them? Well, you listen to them and you ask more questions. Another situation that can come up is another example then of a lady that basically she was believing then that people were breaking into her home and stealing items. Now, this lady was older, so she may have also been moving towards something like Alzheimer's at that time, but also facing bipolar disorder. So one of the things that happened then in that call is that a well-meaning volunteer caller said, I think people are breaking into my home. Volunteer said, okay, let's help you make you safe. So then they proceeded to now say, okay, what can we do to make you safe? Barricade the doors, do this, do that, close the windows, do all this stuff. By the time the CCC, and actually for this story, it wasn't me that was the CCC. By the time the CCC found out that this situation was on the lines, the caller was basically in a puddle of tears in the bathtub because they were so scared. So without meaning to, we can actually make the situation worse. So one of the things in schizophrenia then is we don't want to add to people's delusions. Okay, so you want to be very, very mindful of that. And also remember though that if you think, this person might benefit from talking to a professional, you can always refer them to MRT as well. So that's very, very important. Now we'll give you another example though, where one time I had a caller that he was speaking to me in French. And I speak French, so I was able to try to help him. The problem was, though, that I could make sense of the story, but I could make sense of the words, but not the story, meaning that the things he was saying weren't really matching up. Now, there's a second, and I'm telling you this story, though, in relation to those delusions, that if you're not understanding the story, you want to make sure that you reach out to the CCCs to get some clarification, to have another set of ears that can help you listen to the story and figure out. In that case, it was in French, so eventually I was able to figure out what was going on. But in that story, what the other situation was, and this is something that you're going to be facing on the lines, is that sometimes one of the services that we are providing is that we are providing respite for caregivers. So what will happen on the lines then is you'll get a caller, and the caller, similar to the call I just mentioned, will be telling you a story that's not really making sense to you, and then eventually though, that's disjointed, that sort of thing, and eventually you might just get another person that just grabs the phone and says, oh, thank you so much for being on the lines, I was just taking a shower, I'm gonna let you go now, and then they'll hang up the phone. So sometimes that can happen to our callers, right? Where they'll call us, and then because they're caregivers and they just need a moment that the person that they're taking care of can be distracted then. So they'll call us on the line for that reason. And please know that is very much okay. It is one of those services that we also provide on the lines, right? Some potential respite to caregivers who might just need the person they're caring for to be occupied for a few minutes. Okay.